Hi, I'm Lauren with the Pikes Peak Library District, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about watercolors and doing some simple exercises to get started with them. Now before we jump into these exercises, there's a few things that you're going to need. The first is, of course, a set of watercolor paints and a paintbrush. This is just a little round brush here, but we can use what we have on hand just for these little exercises we're using. You're also definitely going to want a container with some water in it, and if you have a second container you can use, it can be nice to have two on hand, one to clean your brush and one to have clean water to mix into your paints. And last but not least, you are going to need something to paint on. Now this is watercolor paper, so it's a bit thicker than the normal paper you would use, and that prevents the water from soaking through and making it buckle or bleed. Now you can definitely, for these simple exercises, use scratch paper that you have on hand as you're getting used to it, but if you get a little bit more into watercolor, you're definitely going to want watercolor paper, and it will interact a bit differently with the paint than your standard scratch paper, so it's good practice to start out on that as well. There's a few other things that you don't need but that can be really helpful. One is just to have scratch paper on hand that you can use to test out the colors that you're mixing before you apply them to the watercolor paper. It's also really nice to have tissues or paper towels or towels that you can use to blot up any extra water that you get on your paper, or really any extra paint that ends up pooling too much. And of course, a pencil is really useful to have, especially with the kind of graphs and shapes we're going to be making today. Also, if you wanted to sketch a scene and then paint in, a drawing pencil can be a really awesome tool to have for watercolor. This last one is completely optional, but if you're working with loose sheets of paper like this, it can be really nice to tape your paper to your workspace so that you don't have to worry about it moving around. Now again, that's not a huge concern for the kind of exercises we're doing today, but it's definitely something that can be helpful to keep in mind for the future. So once you have all of those things together, we are ready to start painting. Okay, now that you've got your workstation set up and your water nearby, let's go ahead and jump in. Now, one of the most fun parts of watercolor is how the colors blend and mix together. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about color theory and making our own color wheel. You'll get to practice mixing shades, and you'll learn some of the building blocks for painting going forward. So to get started, the first thing you're going to do is to draw a circle. So just grab a pencil, or you could do this lightly and paint if you wanted to. And what we're going to do is we're going to divide our circle into 12 parts. So I'm going to do it first into quarters, and then I'm going to divide every quarter in two. So there we go. And I'm not doing it perfectly equal, because this is just a quick exercise to get used to mixing colors here. But there you go. We've got our circle divided into 12 parts. And the first thing we're going to do is just quickly label and then paint in our primary colors. So first things first, right, we have blue, and then we have red, and then we have yellow. So those are our three primary colors that are the building blocks for every other color, right? So what we're going to do is just quickly paint these in. So pick up some clean water, and then grab, in this case I'm going to start with blue paint. There we go. And I want this to be fairly dark, so I'm not putting too much water on there. I mostly have paint, because I want that darker shade. There we go. So now we've got blue. And then clean your brush off, and let's grab our red next. So a little bit of clean water, a lot of the pigment here, right? And then we'll fill in red on our color wheel. Perfect. Rinse that off, and we're going to do exactly the same thing, but with yellow. And you can see that I am leaving some space between these, I'm just using the lid of my paints here as my palette. Now, if you don't have a lid to your paints, or if you don't like using that as a palette, you could use like a ceramic plate or a dish, anything like that to mix your paints in here. But what I like about this is that it's just a really quick, easy way to blend my paints together without needing something separate on hand. Okay, and now that we've got our primary colors laid down, we're going to do our secondary colors. And our secondary colors are just done by mixing the primaries, right? So blue and red are going to give us purple. So I'm going to write purple in there. Red and yellow are, of course, going to give us orange. And then blue and yellow are going to give us green. And I've got my yellow and my red right here, and I just still have yellow on my brush. So let's go ahead and mix orange first. So we're going to pull in some of that red paint from before with this yellow paint that we've already got on our brush. And there we go. There is our orange. Now, if you have scrap paper or something you could use on hand, or if you want to use the edge of the paper, you can test out the shade before you lay it down. There we go. We need a little more water there. And there we've got our orange. And it can be nice just to have scratch paper for that so that you don't have to commit to the shade on your watercolor paper until you're satisfied with it. So now we've got all of our primary and our secondary colors laid down. And last but not least, we're going to do our tertiary colors. And tertiary colors work exactly the same way that our secondary ones did. You're going to look at the two colors to the left and right, and what's in between is going to be a mix. So in this case, we're going to have blue-purple, in between blue and purple, right? Purple-red, or red-purple, sorry. Red-orange, yellow-orange, yellow-green, and blue-green. And these are formed just by mixing that secondary color with that primary color to get our tertiary color. So we have this purple we just mixed. If we grab more blue to mix into the edge of it, we will have a blue-purple that we can add. There we go. And then we'll clean that off, and then if we mix red into this purple that we just formed, we will end up with our red-purple. So it's pretty straightforward, and you're just going to repeat that for all the different shades here, mixing together your red, orange, yellow, green, and then blue-green. All right, and there we have it. We have our color wheel here. So we've got all of our primary, secondary, and tertiary colors on there. And now that we have those, all those types of colors, we can talk a little bit about how these colors interact with one another. So when you have two colors that are opposite on the color wheel, like red and green, blue and orange, blue, purple, and yellow, orange, those are called complementary colors. So those are colors that are going to have a strong contrast when they're next to each other, and they're really going to pop. But if you blended them together, you'd really just get this kind of muddy, brownish gray. So they look great next to each other. They do not blend very well. Then you also have a different type, and these are going to be the colors that are these three colors next to each other, any three colors that are next to each other on the wheel, and those are called analogous colors. So those are ones that look really good when they're next to each other because they're very similar colors, right? So on the one hand, you've got this high contrast. On the other hand, you've got these analogous colors. And that's something that you can really use when you're planning out a piece or when you're thinking about what colors will look next to one another in a design. And hopefully this exercise has given you a little bit of practice with blending paints and a little more confidence with creating new colors if you maybe don't have the exact shade you're looking for in your palette, or if you want to kind of blend your own paints. It's just a really great skill to get used to and a great thing to play around with. Okay, so we finished up our color wheel. Now let's talk about value. So value is just how dark or light our colors are, right? It's managing the shade of the color that you're working with. And that's a really powerful tool in watercolor, and it's something that's going to give you a lot of control over your designs, especially in creating, shadows and contrast between different sections. So to practice that, what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead real quick and draw 6 boxes on here. There we go. They don't have to be perfect. What we're doing here is just a simple exercise to get used to figuring out how much water you need to add to paint to thin it out. So we're going to leave 1 on our value scale here white. We're not going to paint it at all. And then 6 over here is going to be our darkest shade. So if we were working with something, we could have this value scale for reference so that we would know this is where I want my absolute darkest area to be, this is where I want my absolute lightest area to be, and you could use this scale for reference. So what I would tell you to do is go ahead and choose what color you want to use. I think I'm going to use green. And what you're going to do is start with the very darkest and move lighter. And that just means that we're going to be adding a little bit more water every time that we paint. So we're going to start with just the darkest shade of this green here. There we go. Filling it in, that is our 6. So everything else needs to be lighter relative to this. Now an important thing to remember is that it's easier to go darker if you start too light. It is not possible to go lighter if you start too dark. So err on the side of being too light and going back later to add more pigment, as opposed to starting too dark and not really having anywhere to go. This is also a point where it's really great to have scratch paper, because it's good to be able to test your shade before you lay it down. There you go. I can already tell that needs a little bit more paint in it. Here you are. And if you find that you're getting any of these kind of areas where the paint is pooling or where there's too much water, a really easy thing you can do is take a tissue and just blot it lightly. And that'll pick up some of the paint. You can also use your paintbrusher, of course, and that is another way to pick up some of that excess water or paint that you can end up with. And we're just going to continue on down the line. There we go, 4. So now you can see it's getting gradually lighter, and these will dry a little bit lighter than they started. There we go. So keep that in mind when you're painting. Okay, so we're mixing in more water. You can see I'm adding more water each time, just to make sure that we're going lighter. And then on this very last one, we've got a little bit too much paint down there. Let's pick that up and pull that back out. On this very last one, number 2, we want it to be just 1 shade above the pure white. So I'm going to rinse my brush off, and I'm going to have mostly water with just a teeny tiny amount of paint for this absolute palest shade that you can just barely see on there. So now we've got our white, our very pale green, and then it's getting a little bit darker as we go until we reach this absolute darkest. And this is where you could go back in and say, you know what, I needed maybe a little bit more paint on this one, right? And you could add that in. So you can see, having gone lighter in that case, it's a lot easier to go back later and to darken, whereas if we've gone too dark, there's just no coming back from that. Okay, and so when you're happy with how your value scale looks, you can go ahead and stop, and this will just be a really helpful reference point for yourself to be able to see how much variation you can get within one shade, and to give yourself a sense of how much water you need to add to lighten. So that's a really useful exercise that you can use when you're planning out your painting. Alright, so we've got one last exercise we're going to try. just to learn these two techniques that are really important in watercolor. So there's two things that you'll often hear people talk about, and that is wet on wet and wet on dry. And what that refers to is really just whether you're painting on a wet surface or a dry surface. But that's going to be really important because it gives you very different effects. So if we were doing wet on dry, that would be as simple as picking up some pigment, right? And then just painting straight onto the surface. There you go. And you get a lot of control over where your paint is going. You can have these sharply defined edges, right? When you're painting on this dry surface. Now let's clean our brush off here. And for wet on wet, let's paint a circle just in water. So pick up a little bit of clean water on your brush and draw the circle. It's probably hard to see on the camera, but what you're looking for is for you to have a shiny surface. You want there to be water on there, but you don't want there to be puddles of water pooling on there. That would be too wet, so you might want to blot some out if you ended up with too much. Then you'll pick up some of that pigment, and then do you see how different that is? It is expanding to fill the surface that I've already covered with water. So before we were getting these kind of sharper edges, now you can see it's kind of spreading out, it's a bit looser, and we could add some more paint in here and kind of have some control over, oh, we want this side to be darker and this to be lighter, and you get these kind of cool effects. You can pull it outside of the water if you want to, but it's not going to go outside on its own. So any shape that you paint in just clear water there, it's only going to expand to fill that shape. Now we talked about putting water on here, but wet on wet could also be paint on paint, right? So we could say I want to add a little bit of, pink or purple onto this. And you can see how it spreads on that wet paint there. So it kind of mixes together and you get that kind of marbling effect. Now contrast that with painting, wet on wet, where you're getting these kind of paint spreading out and not having these clear edges, as opposed to painting onto a dry surface where you have this clear variation. So here you can see this had dried, and you don't really get that blending and blurring and bleeding the way you would on this top. It's really just going to go straight through it. Now there's still some degree of blending, right? Because you are putting these two colors on top of each other, but it's not the same as the kind of melding together that you're getting on this wet surface. So that's just a really useful thing to keep in mind when you're painting, is how wet surfaces, or how the paint interacts with a wet surface compared to how it interacts with a dry surface. So if you want these sharper details, you might be doing wet on dry. If you want more of this blurring and blending and kind of traditional watercolor effects, you're going to be painting wet on wet, right? Alright, well I hope you had fun experimenting a little bit with watercolor today and getting to know a little bit about mixing colors and controlling the shade of the paints that we're working with. So I would really encourage you to play around with this and start experimenting with these exercises and with your own designs. Watercolor can be a ton of fun. It's a really relaxing, creative exercise that you can do. So if you're looking for some more resources on techniques in watercolor painting, on exercises, or just on general tips for it, I have some wonderful watercolor resources down in the description here that list some books, some other YouTube series, all sorts of resources that you can get from the library or elsewhere online if you really want to dig into the world of watercolor. So I hope you enjoyed this today. Have a wonderful day and have fun painting.